I was folding his laundry when I heard her giggling from our bedroom, telling someone on the phone, "The old fool has no idea this baby isn't even Richard's. But she's so desperate to save her marriage, she'll raise another man's child just to keep him." That's when I realized my husband's pregnant mistress had been playing us both. You know, after 34 years of marriage, you think you've seen every possible way a person can surprise you. I thought I had weathered Richard's midlife crisis when he bought the motorcycle at 58, endured his sudden passion for expensive golf equipment that sat gathering dust in our garage, even tolerated his new habit of dyeing his graying temples every 3 weeks with some product that made our bathroom smell like chemicals for days afterward. I had accepted his sudden interest in younger music, his embarrassing attempts to use slang he'd picked up from our adult children, and his inexplicable decision to start wearing cologne again after 20 years of claiming he was allergic to fragrances. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the morning he walked into our kitchen with a 26-year-old woman and announced she would be living with us because she was carrying his child and had nowhere else to go. I remember that morning with the kind of crystalline clarity that trauma sometimes brings to memory. It was a Tuesday in early June, unseasonably cool for the season, and I had been standing at the kitchen counter in my favorite blue terry cloth bathrobe, the one our daughter Agatha had given me 3 Christmases ago, methodically going through the morning ritual that had sustained our marriage for over 3 decades. Coffee first 2 cups, his black, mine with cream and 1 sugar, then the newspaper spread between us while we ate breakfast in the comfortable silence of people who had said everything there was to say to each other years ago. The kitchen windows were open to catch the morning breeze, and I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door calling to her cat, the same way she had every morning for the past 15 years. Richard had left for work at his usual time, 8:15 exactly, with his usual perfunctory kiss on my cheek and his usual promise to be home by 6:30 for dinner. Nothing about his demeanor had suggested that this day would be any different from the thousands of other Tuesday mornings we had shared. When he called me at 10:30 to say he was bringing someone home for lunch and that I should prepare something nice, I assumed he meant a client or colleague, someone who needed impressing for business reasons. I spent the morning cleaning the already clean house, preparing chicken salad, sandwiches, and fresh fruit, setting out the good china that we used maybe 6 times a year. When I heard his key in the front door at noon, I was arranging flowers from our garden in a crystal vase, humming quietly to myself and thinking about how pleasant it would be to have company for lunch. The sound of unfamiliar laughter, high and musical and distinctly feminine, made me pause in my flower arranging, but I told myself it must be a new female colleague, perhaps someone from the marketing department he occasionally mentioned. Richard worked for a large consulting firm where the staff skewed younger every year, and it wasn't unusual for him to bring home stories about bright young associates who reminded him of our own children. But when Richard walked into our kitchen, his hand resting possessively on the small of a young woman's back, I knew immediately that this was something else entirely. She was stunning in that particular way that only comes with youth and careful maintenance, long blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, enormous blue eyes enhanced with subtle but expensive makeup, and a figure that somehow managed to be both delicate and voluptuous, despite the small bump visible beneath her fitted dress. She moved with the kind of unconscious grace that made me suddenly aware of my own 58-year-old body, my practical clothing, my sensible shoes. "Claire, honey," Richard said, using that particular tone that always preceded his most outrageous requests, the same voice he had used when he wanted to spend our vacation fund on golf clubs or convert our garage into a workshop that he used exactly twice. "I'd like you to meet Jessica. Jessica, this is my wife, Claire." He paused, and I could see him gathering courage for whatever bombshell he was about to drop. "Jessica is going to be staying with us for a while. She's pregnant, and she's in a difficult situation right now. I stood there holding my vase of garden roses, coffee mug forgotten on the counter, staring at this young woman who was looking back at me with an expression of carefully practiced vulnerability. She extended her hand to me with this breathy little voice, all sweet politeness and manufactured gratitude. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm so grateful you're letting me stay here during this difficult time. Richard has told me so much about you, about what a kind and understanding person you are." The way she said "difficult time," while placing her other hand protectively over her barely visible bump, made something cold and sharp lodge itself in my chest like the tip of a needle. But I shook her hand, because what else do you do when your entire world shifts sideways in the space of 30 seconds? Her skin was soft and cool, her grip firm but not aggressive, and she held eye contact just long enough to seem sincere without appearing challenging. Everything about her seemed calculated to project helpless femininity, while simultaneously asserting her claim to my husband's protection. Richard, meanwhile, had that sheepish expression he wore whenever he'd done something he knew was wrong, but was hoping his charm could smooth over. It was the same expression he had worn when he forgot our anniversary for the 3rd year running, when he spent our vacation fund on golf clubs without consulting me, when he came home drunk from his college reunion and threw up on our bedroom carpet. "Claire, honey," he continued, his voice taking on that wheedling quality that meant he was about to ask me to be reasonable about something completely unreasonable. "Jessica doesn't have family here, and with the baby coming, she needs stability. It's just temporary, until we figure out a more permanent arrangement." The way he said "we," as if this was a mutual decision we'd made together, as if I'd had any say in this bizarre arrangement, as if my opinion mattered at all in this fundamental restructuring of our life, made the needle-sharp pain in my chest spread through my shoulders and down my arms. But I found myself nodding, actually nodding, because 34 years of marriage had trained me to absorb his decisions and find ways to make them work. I had spent over 3 decades smoothing over Richard's impulsive choices, from his spontaneous job changes to his expensive hobbies, to his periodic decisions to reconnect with old friends who invariably turned out to want money or favors. Of course, I heard myself saying, my voice sounding distant and automatic, "We'll make it work somehow." Jessica's smile brightened, and she clasped my hand between both of hers with what seemed like genuine relief. "Oh, Mrs. Whitman, thank you so much. I promise I won't be any trouble. I'll help around the house, I'll cook, I'll do whatever I can to earn my keep. This means everything to me, having a safe place to stay during such an uncertain time." Her voice caught slightly on the word uncertain, and I saw Richard's face soften with protective tenderness. Whatever story she had told him, whatever version of events had led to this moment, it was clear that she had positioned herself as the victim in need of rescue, and Richard had cast himself as the heroic savior. I showed Jessica to the guest room, the same room where my mother had stayed during her final illness 2 years ago, where our children had slept when they visited with their own families during holidays and special occasions. It was a pleasant room with cream-colored walls and antique furniture that had belonged to my grandmother, a space that had always felt like a sanctuary within our home. Jessica walked through it with the assessing eye of someone taking inventory, her fingers trailing over the surfaces of the dresser and nightstand, as if she were already planning how to rearrange things to suit her preferences. "This is perfect," she said, settling onto the bed with a small sigh of satisfaction. "So peaceful and comfortable. You have such beautiful taste, Mrs. Whitman." But her eyes were cataloging everything: the quality of the furniture, the thread count of the linens, the value of the artwork on the walls. I helped her hang up her clothes in the closet, an extensive collection of designer dresses and expensive lingerie that no genuinely pregnant woman should reasonably own, all in perfect condition and obviously costly. As I handled her garments, I found myself wondering how a young woman who supposedly had nowhere to turn and no resources could afford clothing that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The labels were all high-end brands, designers I recognized from magazine advertisements, and department store displays that I walked past but never entered. Her shoes alone represented more money than I spent on clothing in a year. Delicate heels and soft leather boots that showed no signs of the wear you'd expect from someone who had been struggling financially. "You must have a good job," I commented, holding up a silk blouse that probably cost more than my winter coat. Jessica's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, these are mostly gifts. I have generous friends." She didn't elaborate, and something in her tone discouraged further questions. Instead, she began chattering about morning sickness and how challenging this whole situation was for everyone involved, speaking about Richard with this casual possessiveness that made me feel like a visitor in my own life. "Richard has been so wonderful through all of this," she said, arranging her makeup collection on the dresser with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled frequently. "He's exactly the kind of man I hoped I'd find someday, responsible, mature, financially stable. I feel so lucky that he's willing to take care of me and the baby." The way she said "take care of" made it clear that she expected more than temporary shelter. Over the following days and weeks, I began to understand the true scope of what Richard had committed us to. Jessica had a way of making herself indispensable while simultaneously highlighting everything she perceived as my inadequacy. She would wake early and prepare elaborate breakfasts using expensive ingredients that somehow appeared in our refrigerator without my purchasing them. French pastries and exotic fruits and organic everything that must have cost 3 times our usual grocery budget. When Richard came downstairs to find fresh croissants and hand-squeezed orange juice waiting for him, his face would light up with the kind of pleased surprise that made me realize how routine and unremarkable our usual breakfast of toast and coffee must have seemed to him. "This is amazing, Jessica," he would say, buttering his croissant with obvious pleasure. "Claire, you should get the recipe." But of course, Jessica never wrote anything down, claimed it was all intuitive cooking that couldn't be replicated by someone who lacked her natural talent. She would make little comments about how nutrition is so important during pregnancy while I ate my simple sandwich, or mention how much better she felt when she ate clean, whole foods, while looking pointedly at my frozen dinner. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets to be more efficient, moving items I had stored in the same places for 15 years to new locations that made sense only to her. When I couldn't find the coffee filters or the measuring cups, she would appear with helpful suggestions about better systems for organization and gentle observations about how easy it was to fall into unproductive habits. She rearranged the living room furniture to create better energy flow, pushing aside the comfortable chairs where Richard and I had spent countless evenings reading or watching television, to make room for yoga mats and meditation cushions that she used for her prenatal wellness routine. Most invasive of all, she somehow convinced Richard that the house needed a complete technology upgrade so she could work from home on her consulting business. This involved rewiring for high-speed internet, installing multiple monitors and expensive equipment, and converting part of our dining room into what she called her creative workspace. Her consulting business seemed to consist primarily of posting carefully filtered photographs of herself on social media platforms I had never heard of, along with inspirational quotes about pregnancy and motherhood that garnered hundreds of comments from other young women praising her strength and beauty. "It's important to build a brand," she explained when I asked what exactly she consulted about. "I'm developing a platform around conscious pregnancy and mindful parenting. There's a real market for authentic content about the pregnancy experience." I watched her spend hours arranging lighting and taking dozens of photos of herself in various poses that emphasized her growing belly, selecting the most flattering images and editing them with software that could apparently reshape reality at will. Richard, meanwhile, had transformed into someone I barely recognized. He would come home from work and immediately seek out Jessica, asking about her day, her doctor's appointments, her various pregnancy-related needs. His face would light up when he saw her, the same expression he used to reserve for our children when they were small, and would run to greet him at the door. He bought her special pregnancy pillows that cost more than our monthly electric bill, prenatal vitamins that seemed to contain every mineral known to science, and one of those expensive machines that supposedly monitored the baby's heartbeat so she could listen to it whenever she wanted. In the evenings, he would sit beside her on the couch in our living room, his hand resting on her growing belly, talking softly about baby names and nursery themes, while I sat in my usual chair feeling like an unwelcome observer in my own marriage. They would discuss the baby's future with the kind of intimate planning that married couples typically reserved for private moments, while I pretended to read or watch television and tried to ignore the growing certainty that I had become irrelevant in my own life. I was thinking about the name Alexander. Richard would say, his voice soft with tenderness, after my grandfather. He was a good man, a strong man. I'd like the baby to carry that legacy. Jessica would smile and place her hand over his, agreeing that Alexander was perfect, that she could already tell the baby would be strong and intelligent like his father. They spoke about college funds and family traditions, about teaching the child to play golf and taking family vacations to places Richard and I had talked about visiting but never managed to afford. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, present but invisible, hearing conversations about a future that apparently didn't include me. When I tried to participate in these discussions, Jessica would smile politely and redirect the conversation back to herself and Richard, as if my opinions about child-rearing, despite the fact that I had successfully raised 2 children to independent adulthood, were quaint but irrelevant. "Oh, Mrs. Whitman," she would say with that sweet, dismissive tone. "Parenting is so different now than it was when you had your children. There's so much new research about child development and nutrition and educational approaches. It's really fascinating how much we've learned." The implication was clear. My experience was outdated, my methods obsolete, my role in this new family structure purely decorative. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, one of those perfect October days when the leaves were just beginning to change and the air carried the promise of winter. I had taken the day off work to finally tackle the massive pile of laundry that had accumulated not just Richard's and mine, but now Jessica's seemingly endless collection of delicate fabrics that required special care and attention. Her clothes needed to be washed in cold water with expensive detergent, dried flat rather than in the machine, and many items required hand washing that took hours to complete properly. I was in the utility room, methodically sorting through the various loads and thinking about how my simple laundry routine had become a complex production that consumed entire days, when I heard Jessica's phone ring in the bedroom above. The house was old, built in 1962, with heating vents and thin walls that carried sound in strange ways, and I had learned to tune out most of her conversations, which typically involved complaints about her various pregnancy discomforts or requests for money, from what seemed like an endless parade of friends and family members who always seemed to be experiencing financial emergencies that required her immediate assistance. But something about her tone that afternoon was different. There was a lightness to it, a kind of giddy excitement that made me pause in my folding and listen more carefully. The quality of her voice was unlike anything I had heard from her before, not the carefully modulated sweetness she used with Richard, not the polite gratitude she showed me, but something genuine and unguarded that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh my God, Marcus," she was saying, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the kind of delighted anticipation that people have when they're sharing their most treasured secrets. "You should see how easy this island. The old fool has no idea this baby isn't even Richard's. But she's so desperate to save her marriage, she'll raise another man's child just to keep him. It's actually kind of pathetic how grateful she is that I'm letting her husband pretend to be the father. I set down the shirt I was holding, one of Richard's expensive dress shirts that Jessica had somehow convinced him to buy to update his professional image, and moved closer to the heating vent, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was afraid the sound might carry upstairs. The utility room suddenly felt airless, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out through the vent that was now carrying Jessica's voice to me with perfect, devastating clarity. Jessica was still talking, her voice carrying that particular tone of delighted malice that some people use when they're sharing their cruelest secrets, the same voice that playground bullies use when they've discovered something humiliating about their victims. I know, I should feel bad about it, but honestly, they deserve each other. He's desperate to feel young again, and she's desperate to feel needed. This baby is going to set us up perfectly once it's born and we establish paternity fraud. We can sue them for everything they've got. There was a pause, and I could hear the murmur of another voice through her phone, though I couldn't make out the words. Jessica laughed in response, a sound like breaking glass, sharp and cutting and completely unlike the musical giggle she used around Richard. Richard's been paying all my expenses, putting money aside for his child, even talking about changing his will to include provisions for the baby. The stupid man actually thinks he's building a legacy, passing on the family name to a new generation. If he only knew that this kid is going to have your eyes and your stubborn streak. Another pause, longer this time, and when Jessica spoke again, her voice had taken on a calculating quality that made my skin crawl. Of course the baby's yours, Marcus. You think I'd actually sleep with that old man? God, the thought makes me physically sick. I've been faking everything, the whole devoted pregnant girlfriend act, the grateful victim routine, even most of the morning sickness. Did you know you can buy pregnancy tests that show positive results? They sell them online for pranks and theatrical productions. Richard never even thought to question it, because his ego is so massive, he can't imagine a young woman wouldn't want his baby. I stood there in my utility room, surrounded by baskets of carefully sorted laundry, listening to this young woman casually detail the elaborate fraud she was perpetrating against my husband, and, by extension, against me. The needle-sharp pain in my chest was spreading now, radiating through my shoulders and down my arms. But it wasn't the pain of betrayal I had expected. Instead, it was something else entirely. A kind of crystalline clarity that made everything suddenly, brutally clear. Jessica was continuing her conversation, describing her plans with the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that her victims might be real people with real feelings. The beauty of it is, she was saying, by the time we drop the bomb, they'll have invested so much money and emotion in this whole fantasy that they'll pay anything to make it go away quietly. Richard won't want his colleagues to know he's been played by someone young enough to be his daughter, and she certainly won't want people to know her husband got scammed by a gold-digging slut. The casual way she used that word, the dismissive tone in which she spoke about my marriage and my feelings, hit me like a physical blow. I had been prepared for Richard's betrayal. Some part of me had suspected for months that something was wrong, that his sudden changes in behavior and his mysterious absences meant another woman was involved. But I had not been prepared for this level of calculated malice, this elaborate scheme designed not just to steal my husband, but to systematically destroy both of us financially and emotionally. "Oh, Marcus, I wish you could see her," Jessica continued, her voice full of malicious amusement. "She tries so hard to be the perfect hostess, making my meals and doing my laundry like she's grateful for the privilege. She actually thanked me yesterday for sharing Richard with her, as if she should be honored that I'm allowing her husband to pretend this baby is his. The woman has absolutely no spine, no self-respect. It's almost too easy." I walked back to my laundry pile and continued folding, but my hands were working automatically, while my mind raced through possibilities and implications. You see, Jessica had made one crucial error in her calculations. The kind of mistake that people make when they're so absorbed in their own cleverness that they fail to gather adequate intelligence about their targets. She had assumed that I was the desperate, pathetic woman she described to Marcus, someone so afraid of losing her husband that she would accept any humiliation, endure any betrayal, just to maintain the illusion of marriage. She had looked at my sensible clothes, my quiet demeanor, my willingness to accommodate this insane living arrangement, and she had seen weakness where she should have seen strategy. She had interpreted my politeness as submission, my cooperation as desperation, my careful maintenance of household harmony as evidence that I would do anything to avoid conflict. But Jessica didn't understand that there's a difference between choosing your battles and being unable to fight. What Jessica didn't know, couldn't have known because Richard himself had forgotten over the years, was that I wasn't just the accommodating wife who did laundry and made sandwiches and arranged flowers in crystal vases. Before I became Mrs. Richard Whitman, before I spent 3 decades managing our household and raising our children and supporting my husband's career ambitions, I had been Claire Morrison, the youngest person ever to make partner at Morrison, Hayes and Associates, one of the most prestigious family law firms in the state. I had spent 15 years before my marriage helping women navigate divorces, custody battles, and financial disputes, specializing in cases involving fraud, hidden assets, and complex financial manipulation. I had successfully represented clients in some of the most challenging family law cases in state history, including several high-profile divorces involving celebrities and politicians, where the opposing parties had attempted to hide millions of dollars in assets. I had developed a reputation for being thorough, strategic, and absolutely ruthless when protecting my clients' interests. When Richard and I married, and especially after our children were born, he had gradually convinced me that staying home would be better for our family. It started with practical arguments, the demands of his job, the needs of small children, the complications of managing 2 high-powered careers simultaneously. Then it became about family values and traditional roles, about creating stability and being present for the important moments in our children's lives. Eventually, it became simply easier to let him be the primary breadwinner while I managed everything else. But I had maintained my law license throughout the years, attending continuing education courses and staying current with changes in family law. I had even done pro bono work for the local women's shelter, helping abuse victims navigate legal processes and protect their assets from violent partners. Richard knew about this work, of course, but over the years, he had stopped mentioning my professional background, and I had let him. It was easier to let people think of me as just a wife and mother, to avoid the complications that came with being a woman who had given up a successful career for family. More importantly, Jessica had no idea that the house she was living in, the house she was helping herself to and rearranging according to her preferences, wasn't Richard's property at all. It had been mine, inherited from my grandmother when I was 25, and carefully kept in my name alone through every refinancing and home improvement loan over the past 30 years. Richard paid the mortgage and maintenance costs, certainly, and he had contributed to renovations and improvements. But the deed had always carried my name alone, and it always would. Jessica also couldn't have known that while Richard had been busy playing provider for his pregnant girlfriend, spending money on baby furniture and prenatal care and expensive supplements, I had been quietly documenting every expense, every purchase, every financial transaction related to this bizarre arrangement. My legal training had taught me to keep meticulous records, and old habits die hard. I had receipts, bank statements, credit card records, and detailed logs of every dollar that had been spent on Jessica's care and comfort. The next morning, I called my old firm and made an appointment with Tom Hayes, who had been my mentor 20 years ago and was now the senior partner. I told his secretary that I needed to discuss a complex domestic situation, and would appreciate his discretion. Tom had always been sharp as a blade, one of those lawyers who could spot a scam from 3 counties away, and I knew that if anyone could help me navigate this situation, it would be him. The Morrison, Hayes, and Associates offices hadn't changed much in the 20 years since I'd left. The same rich wood paneling, the same leather-bound law books, the same sense of quiet authority that came from decades of successful practice. Tom's office was exactly as I remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk that had belonged to his father, and windows that looked out over the city's legal district. Tom himself had aged gracefully, his hair now completely silver, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and curiosity. When I walked into his office, he stood and embraced me with genuine warmth, but I could see him cataloging the changes in my appearance, the subtle signs of stress and exhaustion that I thought I had hidden better. "Claire Morrison," he said, using my maiden name the way he always had. "It's been too long. You look well." It was a polite lie, but I appreciated the courtesy. "Tom, I need help," I said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I have a situation that requires both legal expertise and absolute discretion." He leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming serious. "Tell me everything." I spent the next hour laying out the entire situation: Richard's affair, Jessica's pregnancy claims, the living arrangement that had been imposed on me, and finally, the conversation I had overheard the previous day. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more grim as the story unfolded. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at his notes. Finally, he looked up at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with professional excitement. "Claire," he said, shaking his head slowly, "this young woman has managed to commit fraud against your husband while simultaneously giving you grounds for the cleanest divorce case I've seen in years. She's living in your house, spending your marital assets under false pretenses, and apparently planning to extort both of you. The beautiful thing is, we don't even need to prove the paternity fraud to destroy her, we just need to prove intent to defraud, which she's helpfully documented in her phone conversations." He leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the state. "But Claire, before we proceed, I need to ask you something important. What do you want the outcome to be? Do you want to save your marriage and simply remove this woman from your life? Do you want to punish her for what she's done, or do you want to start over completely?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that for the first time in months, someone was asking me what I wanted, instead of telling me what I should accept. "I want my life back," I said finally. "I want to be in control of my own decisions, my own home, my own future. I want Richard to face the consequences of his choices, and I want Jessica to understand that she picked the wrong target." Tom smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey. "Then let's get started." He connected me with a private investigator named Tonia Brown, a former police detective who specialized in domestic fraud cases. Agatha was a small, precise woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of a room within seconds of entering it. When I explained the situation, she nodded grimly and said, "I've seen this exact scam 4 times in the past 2 years. Young woman targets older man going through midlife crisis, fake pregnancy or pregnancy with wrong father, move into the family home, establish financial dependence, then extortion. The twist with your case is that she's actually pregnant, just not with his baby. That makes it both easier to prove and potentially more damaging to her." Agatha's approach was methodical and thorough. She installed listening devices throughout the house, perfectly legal, since it was my property and I was consenting to the surveillance of conversations taking place in my own home. She also began tracking Jessica's movements, her phone calls, her social media activity, and her financial transactions. Within a week, We had begun to assemble a comprehensive picture of Jessica's real life, and it was even worse than I had imagined. Jessica wasn't just running a simple paternity fraud. She was operating what Agatha called a multiple mark romance scam with military precision. She had at least 3 other men who believed they might be the father of her baby, each one providing financial support and emotional investment while believing they were the only one. There was Marcus, the man I had heard her talking to, who appeared to be her actual boyfriend and the real father of her baby. There was a recently divorced executive named David, who had been paying her rent and medical expenses. And there was a widowed retiree named Frank, who had been sending her money for emergency expenses that never seemed to resolve. Marcus turned out to be a small-time criminal with a history of fraud, theft, and identity scams dating back to his teenage years. He and Jessica had been working together for over 2 years, targeting vulnerable men and extracting money through various romantic cons. They had apparently met in a community college criminal justice class where Marcus was serving a court-ordered sentence for financial fraud, and Jessica was working on what she claimed was a degree in social work, but which was actually just a cover for meeting potential marks. The most disturbing discovery was that Jessica had been carefully researching Richard's and my financial situation with professional thoroughness. She had somehow obtained copies of our tax returns from the past 5 years, gained access to our credit reports, and had even photographed documents from Richard's home office when he wasn't around. Agatha's investigation revealed that Jessica and Marcus had been planning their approach for months before Jessica ever made contact with Richard, studying his patterns, his vulnerabilities, his financial status, and even his relationship with me. They had calculated, quite precisely, how much they could extract from us before we would find it cheaper to simply pay them off rather than endure a public legal battle. Their plan involved claiming not just child support for 18 years, but filing a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking damages for the trauma of being involved with a married man who had promised to leave his wife but then abandoned her when she became pregnant. According to the documents Agatha recovered from Marcus's apartment, they estimated they could get between $2 and $3 million from us through a combination of settlement payments, child support, and ongoing extortion threats. They had researched the value of our house, our retirement accounts, Richard's income potential, and even our children's financial situations to determine the maximum amount we might be able to pay to make them disappear. But Jessica's most significant miscalculation was her assumption about my character and capabilities. She had seen a woman who accommodated her husband's unreasonable demands and concluded that I was weak. She had mistaken strategic patience for helplessness, collaborative problem-solving for submission, and careful household management for an inability to think beyond domestic concerns. She couldn't have known that I had spent years helping other women reclaim their power from people exactly like her, or that I understood the legal system well enough to turn her own tactics against her with devastating effectiveness. The plan Agatha and I developed was elegant in its simplicity and comprehensive in its scope. We would let Jessica continue her performance until she made her first official move, but we would be ready for her with overwhelming evidence and legal responses that would destroy her completely. Agatha's surveillance had revealed that Jessica was planning to announce the paternity fraud right after the baby was born, when our emotional investment would be at its peak and our ability to think clearly would be at its lowest. She intended to present us with DNA evidence proving Richard wasn't the father, along with a demand for a substantial settlement to keep the whole thing quiet and avoid traumatizing the innocent child with a public scandal. What she didn't know was that we would be prepared with our own evidence, our own legal strategy, and our own timeline that would leave her with nothing but criminal charges and a prison sentence. I spent the next several weeks playing my role as the accommodating wife while systematically building an ironclad case against Jessica and Marcus. I continued doing Jessica's laundry, cooking her meals, and listening to her complaints about pregnancy discomfort all while wearing a small recording device that captured her every word and documented her ongoing fraud. Every conversation was transcribed, every phone call was recorded, every financial transaction was documented with meticulous precision. I scheduled my own doctor's appointments and started therapy sessions, creating a documented record of the emotional distress this situation was causing me, while establishing my credibility as a victim of fraud rather than a willing participant. I quietly moved my personal assets into accounts that Richard couldn't access, transferred ownership of certain valuable items into my name alone, and began preparing the paperwork for what would be a very straightforward and very devastating divorce. Most importantly, I began rebuilding my professional network, reaching out to former colleagues and clients, updating my knowledge of current family law precedents, and preparing to return to legal practice after a 20-year hiatus. The law had changed significantly during my absence, but the fundamental principles remained the same, and I discovered that my instincts and analytical skills were as sharp as they had ever been. Richard, meanwhile, had become completely absorbed in his fantasy of impending fatherhood. He converted our home office into an elaborate nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assembling an expensive crib that he had chosen with Jessica during one of their shopping expeditions. The room that had once been my workspace, where I had handled household finances and managed our family's administrative needs, was now filled with stuffed animals and baby monitors and a changing table that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. He bought parenting books and started talking about taking paternity leave, about how this baby would give him a chance to be a better father than he had been to our own children when they were small. He spoke about teaching the child to play golf, about family vacations and college funds, and passing on family traditions that he had never shown much interest in when Agatha and Michael were growing up. "I feel like I'm getting a second chance," he told me one evening as we stood in the doorway of the newly completed nursery, looking at the crib and rocking chair and shelves full of toys that Jessica had deemed essential for proper child development. I was so focused on work when Agatha and Michael were babies, so worried about providing for the family financially, that I missed out on a lot of the day-to-day experiences. This time is going to be different. The irony was almost overwhelming. Richard had indeed missed much of our children's early years, but not because of work pressures, because he had chosen to prioritize golf games and poker nights and weekend fishing trips with his friends over family time. Now, he was projecting all of his regrets and unfulfilled paternal fantasies onto a child that wasn't even his, being manipulated by a woman who saw him as nothing more than a source of financial support for her elaborate fraud. Watching him throw himself into this delusion would have been heartbreaking if I hadn't known exactly how it was going to end. He would come home from work with bags full of baby supplies, his face bright with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen from him in years. He bought educational toys recommended by child development experts, organic cotton clothing that cost more per item than I typically spent on my own wardrobe, and specialized equipment for monitoring everything from room temperature to air quality in the nursery. Jessica was telling me about this new research on infant brain development, he would say over dinner, his voice animated with newfound expertise. Apparently, the first 6 months are absolutely critical for establishing neural pathways. We want to make sure this baby has every possible advantage. He spoke about prenatal music and infant massage techniques, about the importance of reading to babies even before they were born, about creating an environment that would foster optimal cognitive development. Jessica, for her part, played her role to perfection. She would sit at our dinner table, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly, listening to Richard's plans with what appeared to be rapt attention and genuine gratitude. She asked thoughtful questions about his research, made appreciative comments about his preparation efforts, and occasionally shared carefully researched information about pregnancy and child development that made her seem like the ideal partner for raising a child. "Richard, you're going to be such an amazing father," she would say, her voice soft with what seemed like genuine affection. "This baby is so lucky to have someone who cares so much about doing everything right." She would reach across the table to squeeze his hand, and I would watch his face light up with the kind of pride and purpose that I remembered from the early days of our own marriage, before years of routine and compromise had worn away the sharp edges of romantic love. But I was listening to these conversations with the awareness of what Jessica really thought about Richard, about me, about the whole situation. Every sweet comment, every grateful smile, every gesture of intimacy was a calculated performance designed to maintain Richard's emotional investment until she was ready to spring her trap. The contrast between her public persona and her private conversations with Marcus was so stark that it was like watching two completely different people inhabit the same body. The breaking point came on a cold November evening, just as Jessica was entering her third trimester, and her pregnancy had become impossible to ignore or dismiss. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something simple and healthy that wouldn't upset Jessica's increasingly sensitive stomach, when she came downstairs carrying her phone and wearing that particular expression of barely contained excitement that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Richard was in the living room, watching a football game with the volume turned up loud enough that he wouldn't overhear our conversation. Jessica settled herself at the kitchen island with the elaborate care of someone performing pregnancy for an audience, placing both hands on her belly and giving me what I'm sure she thought was a meaningful woman-to-woman look. "Claire," she said, her voice taking on that intimate, conspiratorial tone that always preceded her most manipulative requests. "I need to talk to you about something important. Woman to woman, about our situation here." I continued chopping vegetables for the salad, keeping my expression neutral and my voice level. "Of course, Jessica. What's on your mind?" She smiled then, and there was something predatory in it. Something that reminded me of a cat that had cornered a mouse and was taking time to play with it before delivering the killing blow. "I know this situation has been difficult for you, and I want you to know how much I appreciate how gracious you've been about everything. Not every woman would be able to handle her husband having a baby with someone else." She paused, letting that sink in, watching my face for signs of the pain she was trying to inflict. "But here's the thing, Claire. I've been thinking about what's best for everyone involved, especially the baby, and I've realized that this current arrangement isn't sustainable long-term." "Oh?" I kept my voice carefully neutral while my hands continued their steady work, though every nerve in my body was alert and ready. "Well, think about it realistically," she continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Richard is going to be a father again, which means his priorities are going to shift completely. He's going to want to focus on his new family, his new responsibilities, and you've been such a wonderful part of our lives, such a supportive presence during this transition, but I think we all know that eventually Richard and I are going to want our own space, our own home, where we can raise this baby properly." She was using that breathy, sympathetic tone that made every word sound like a condolence, as if she were gently breaking news of a terminal illness rather than planning to steal my entire life. "I know how much you love this house, how much history you have here, but I think it might be time to start thinking about your future, your independent future. Richard mentioned that you have a sister in Florida. Maybe this would be a good opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to build a new life that's entirely your own." I set down my knife and turned to face her fully, letting her see the full attention she had been working so hard to capture. "Jessica, are you suggesting that I should leave my own home?" She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but only slightly, and only for a moment. "I'm just thinking practically, Claire, about what's best for everyone. Richard and I are going to need space for the baby, room to grow as a family. And honestly, it might be healthier for everyone if we had some boundaries, some separation between the old life and the new one. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more earnest, more apparently sincere. I know this is hard to hear, and I don't want you to think I'm being cruel or ungrateful. But Richard has told me some things about your marriage, about how it's been more of a habit than a real partnership for years now. He loves you, of course he does, but he's not in love with you anymore. Having this baby has made him realize what he's been missing, what real passion and connection feel like. The needle-sharp pain was back in my chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a kind of fierce, cold satisfaction. Jessica was finally making her move, finally revealing the true scope of her ambitions and the depth of her cruelty. She didn't just want Richard's money or temporary support for her pregnancy. She didn't just want to extract a settlement and disappear. She wanted my entire life, my home, my husband, my identity, my place in the world. And she wanted me to hand it over willingly, gratefully, as if she were doing me a favor by stealing everything I had built over 34 years. That's a very interesting perspective, I said calmly, my voice giving away nothing of what I was thinking or feeling. And I suppose you and Richard have discussed this plan in detail? Well, not in so many words, she admitted, though her confidence didn't waver. But I can tell what he's thinking, what he wants. He's been so much happier these past few months, so much more alive and energetic. It's like he's finally remembered who he used to be before he got bogged down with all the responsibilities and compromises of a long marriage. She gestured vaguely around the kitchen, encompassing not just the room, but apparently everything it represented. The years of shared meals and quiet conversations, the accumulated weight of domestic routine, the comfortable but unexciting reality of middle-aged marriage. He needs room to breathe, space to rediscover himself, and I can give him that in a way that you simply can't anymore. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were seriously considering her words rather than cataloging them as evidence for the legal case that would destroy her. I can see how you might interpret things that way, Jessica, but I think there are some aspects of the situation that you might not fully understand. Such as, her voice carried a note of challenge now, as if she were tired of pretending to be concerned about my feelings and was ready to dispense with the pretense of kindness. Such as the fact that this house belongs to me, not Richard. Such as the fact that I've been recording our conversations for the past month, including the one where you told Marcus that the baby isn't Richard's and described your plan to defraud us. Such is the fact that I've been building a comprehensive legal case against you and your boyfriend for fraud, extortion, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. I kept my voice perfectly level, conversational even, as if I were discussing dinner plans or weekend shopping rather than the complete destruction of her carefully constructed scheme. I'm also a lawyer, Jessica, and I'm very good at building cases. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate when I overheard you bragging about your scam? Did you honestly believe I would just accept being pushed out of my own life by someone who isn't even smart enough to run a convincing fraud? The transformation in Jessica's face was remarkable and immediate. The practiced sweetness drained away like water, leaving something sharp and desperate and ugly in its place. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the calculating predator that had been hiding beneath the performance of vulnerable femininity. "You're lying," she said. But her voice had lost its breathy confidence and taken on a harsh, almost panicked quality. "You can't prove any of that. And even if you could, Richard would never believe you over me. He loves me. He's committed to this baby, to our future together. I'm not lying, Jessica. I'm a lawyer, and I'm very good at building cases." I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick manila folder that I had been carrying with me for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. These are copies of everything my private investigator has compiled over the past month. Your real identity, your criminal history, Marcus's criminal history, your medical records showing exactly when you got pregnant and who you were seeing at the time, records of your financial transactions with multiple men, and transcripts of every conversation you've had in this house for the past 6 weeks. I opened the folder and showed her the first page, a photograph of her and Marcus together, clearly intimate, with a timestamp showing it was taken just 2 days ago, while Richard was at work and she was supposedly at a prenatal yoga class. Here's you with the real father of your baby. Tonya Brown, my investigator, has been very thorough. She's a former police detective who specializes in exactly this type of fraud, and she's built cases that have sent people like you to prison for decades. Jessica stared at the photograph as if it might spontaneously combust, and I could almost see her mind racing through possibilities, looking desperately for an escape route or a way to salvage her plan. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and her hands were trembling as she reached out to touch the edge of the folder. "There's more," I continued, turning to the next page, which showed a detailed timeline of her movements over the past month. Bank records showing deposits from David Kellerman and Frank Martinez, the other men you've been running the scam on. Phone records showing daily conversations with Marcus. Social media posts that you thought you had deleted, but which Agatha recovered from backup servers. Credit reports showing that you've been using multiple identities for the past 3 years. I flipped through several more pages, letting her see the scope and detail of the evidence we had assembled. Medical records from the clinic where you got your fake pregnancy test. Financial records showing that Marcus has been using the money you've collected to pay off his gambling debts. And this is my personal favorite. A recording of you telling Marcus that Richard is pathetic and that you can't wait to take these idiots for everything they're worth. Jessica's face had gone completely white, and she was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if she might fall over. "You can't do this to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's illegal. You can't record someone without their consent. You can't invade someone's privacy like that." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "This is my house, and in this state, only one party needs to consent to recording conversations. That would be me. As for privacy, you forfeited any right to privacy when you moved into my home under false pretenses and began defrauding my family." She tried one last desperate gambit, her voice taking on a pleading quality that might have been convincing if I hadn't heard her real voice, her real opinions, her real plans. "Okay, fine, maybe I made some mistakes, but we don't have to involve the police or lawyers or any of that. Richard doesn't need to know about any of this. We can work something out between us, woman to woman. I'll leave quietly, and you can tell him whatever you want about why I'm gone. He never has to know about Marcus, or the baby, or any of the rest of it. Oh, but he does need to know, Jessica. He absolutely needs to know exactly who you are and what you've been doing in our home." I closed the folder and smiled at her, the first genuine smile I had given her since the day she'd arrived. "Richard is going to know everything. Tonight. Every lie you've told, every dollar you've stolen, every cruel thing you've said about both of us. He's going to know that he's been supporting another man's child while being played for a fool by someone who considers him pathetic and disgusting." The last vestige of Jessica's composure cracked completely. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice rising to almost a shout before she caught herself and glanced toward the living room where Richard was still watching television. "I'm pregnant, for God's sake. Do you know what this will do to me? Do you know what this will do to my baby? What it will do to you?" I said, my voice still perfectly calm and level. "Is exactly what you plan to do to us, except that you'll be facing it alone, while Richard and I will be facing it together. You see, Jessica, you made one fundamental error in your planning. You assumed that I was the weak link in this situation. Someone who could be manipulated and discarded when you were finished with her. I stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. But I'm not weak, and I'm not disposable. I'm the woman whose house you've been living in, whose husband you've been defrauding, and whose life you've been systematically trying to steal. And now I'm the lawyer who's going to destroy you so completely that you'll spend the next 10 years wishing you had never heard the name Richard Whitman. That evening, after Jessica had packed her designer clothes and called Marcus to pick her up, disappearing into the night like the predator she had always been, I sat Richard down in our living room and methodically presented him with everything Agatha and I had discovered. I showed him the photographs, played him the recordings, walked him through the financial evidence, and explained exactly how Jessica and Marcus had been planning to defraud us out of everything we had worked for over 34 years of marriage. I watched 3 decades of our shared life collapse in his face as he realized the full scope of his own gullibility, the complete extent to which he had been manipulated and used. It was painful to watch, but necessary. He needed to understand not just that he had been betrayed, but how thoroughly and expertly he had been played. "Claire," he said when I finished, his voice barely above a whisper, his face gray with shock and shame, "I am so sorry. I don't know how to even begin to apologize for what I've put you through. I don't know how I could have been so stupid, so blind to what was happening." He looked around our living room, the room where we had celebrated our children's birthdays and anniversaries, where we had comforted each other through family deaths and job losses, where we had built a life together through decades of compromise and cooperation, as if he were seeing it for the first time. "How did I not see what she was doing?" he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "How did I let myself be taken in so completely? I risked everything we built together for someone who was lying to me from the very beginning." "You can start making amends," I said calmly, reaching into my briefcase for another folder, "by signing these divorce papers." The shock on his face was immediate and complete. "Claire, please, don't do this. I know I made a terrible mistake, but we can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, to rebuild your trust. Jessica is gone. The whole nightmare is over. We can go back to the way things were." But that was exactly what I didn't want to go back to the way things were. To return to the comfortable but suffocating routine of a marriage that had become more habit than choice, more convenience than love. Jessica's presence in our home had shown me something important about my own life, about the extent to which I had been sleepwalking through my own existence. "Richard," I said, gently but firmly, "this isn't just about Jessica. This is about the fact that you brought another woman into our home and asked me to take care of her. This is about the fact that you were prepared to raise another man's child without ever considering how that would affect me, our children, our future. This is about the fact that you made a unilateral decision that fundamentally changed our marriage without consulting me or considering my feelings." I opened the divorce folder and showed him the paperwork that Tom Hayes had prepared. "But more than that, this is about the fact that I don't want to be married to someone who could be so easily manipulated, so willing to throw away 34 years of partnership for the fantasy of reclaiming his youth with a woman young enough to be his daughter." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Jessica and Marcus tried to flee the state when they realized the scope of the evidence against them. But Agatha had anticipated that possibility and had been monitoring their movements and communications. They were arrested at a bus station in Nevada, trying to board a Greyhound to Mexico with false identification and several $1,000s in cash that Marcus had withdrawn from accounts funded by Jessica's various fraud victims. The criminal trial was a sensation in our small city, making front-page news for weeks as the details of their elaborate con game emerged. The prosecutor, armed with Agatha's meticulously documented evidence, was able to prove not only the fraud against Richard and me, but also similar schemes targeting at least 7 other men across 3 states. Jessica and Marcus were ultimately sentenced to significant prison time and ordered to pay restitution that would ensure they spent decades paying back the money they had stolen from their various victims. The media attention was uncomfortable but brief, and I was pleased to discover that public opinion was entirely on my side. Far from being seen as the pathetic, desperate wife that Jessica had described to Marcus, I was portrayed as a clever woman who had outsmarted professional criminals and protected not only herself but other potential victims. Several women reached out to me to share their own stories of being targeted by similar scams, and I began to understand that what had happened to us was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior that specifically targeted older, financially stable couples. Richard, for his part, didn't contest the divorce. The evidence of his betrayal was so overwhelming and his shame so complete that he signed away his rights to everything without argument. He moved into a small apartment across town and began the long process of rebuilding his life and his relationships with our adult children, who were initially furious with him but eventually found ways to maintain limited contact. Our son Michael, who was 28 and worked as an engineer in California, was particularly harsh in his judgment. "Dad, how could you be so stupid?" he said during one of their difficult phone conversations. "How could you risk everything Mom built for you, everything our family stood for some woman who was obviously running a scam?" Our daughter Agatha, who was 31 and had 2 young children of her own, was more focused on the practical implications. "Mom, are you going to be okay financially?" she asked when she called to check on me. "Do you need help with anything? Should we be worried about your security?" I assured both of them that I was fine, that I had protected our assets and was more than capable of taking care of myself. In fact, I told them I was looking forward to the next chapter of my life with more enthusiasm than I had felt in years. As for me, I kept the house that had always been mine, returned to practicing law full-time, and discovered that I had forgotten how much I enjoyed the intellectual challenge and emotional satisfaction helping people navigate the worst moments of their lives. Tom Hayes welcomed me back to the firm as a senior associate, and within 2 years, I had made partner again. My experience with Jessica had given me a particular expertise in fraud cases involving romance scams and financial exploitation of older adults, and I became something of a specialist in this growing area of law. I helped other women who had been targeted by similar schemes, worked with law enforcement to identify and prosecute scam artists, and even testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. The work was challenging and meaningful in a way that my domestic life had never been. Every case was a puzzle to be solved. Every client was someone who needed my skills and experience to reclaim their power from people who had tried to exploit their vulnerability or kindness. I found that the combination of my legal training and my personal experience made me uniquely effective at understanding both the emotional and practical aspects of these crimes. The house feels different now, lighter, somehow, as if removing Jessica's presence had cleared the air of more than just her expensive perfume and manipulative energy. I've redecorated extensively, erasing every trace of the changes she made to suit her preferences. The guest room where she stayed has become my home office, with built-in bookshelves filled with law books and legal journals, a comfortable reading chair by the window, and a desk where I can work on cases in the evenings. The nursery that Richard painted with such hope and excitement has been converted into my exercise room, painted a cheerful blue and filled with equipment that helps me maintain the physical strength I've rediscovered, along with my emotional and professional strength. The room that was briefly meant to house another woman's child is now a space dedicated entirely to my own health and well-being. Most surprisingly, I've begun dating again. Nothing serious, just dinner and theater and conversation with intelligent, interesting men who appreciate my independence and professional accomplishments rather than seeing them as threats or inconveniences. It's remarkable how different it feels to be valued for my mind and my achievements, rather than for my willingness to accommodate someone else's needs and priorities. Tom Hayes introduced me to a retired federal judge named Robert Crawford, whose wife had died of cancer 3 years ago, and who was slowly rebuilding his social life. Robert is 72, distinguished, and intellectually curious in a way that Richard never was. Our conversations range from legal theory to classical music to travel plans, and he listens to my opinions as if they matter, asks thoughtful questions about my cases, and treats my professional success as something to be celebrated rather than something that competes with his own ego. "You know, Claire," he said during one of our dinners, "I've been watching your work with these fraud cases, and I'm impressed by how you've turned your personal experience into professional expertise. That takes real strength and wisdom." It was the first time in years that a man had complimented my professional abilities rather than my cooking or my appearance or my willingness to make his life more comfortable. The recognition felt like sunshine after decades of shadow. Sometimes I think about Jessica and wonder if prison taught her anything about the consequences of underestimating people, about the difference between kindness and weakness, about the dangers of targeting someone's compassion without understanding their capabilities. I wonder if she learned that accommodating behavior from a mature woman often masks strategic thinking rather than submission, that grace under pressure can be a sign of strength rather than helplessness. Mostly, though, I don't think about her at all. She was a problem that I solved, a threat that I neutralized, a lesson in my own resilience that I'm grateful to have learned. She taught me that I had never actually lost the skills and instincts that made me successful. In my 20s and 30s, I had simply been using them in service of someone else's ambitions rather than my own. The most surprising thing about the whole experience was discovering that I had never actually needed Richard's presence to feel complete or worthwhile. What I had needed was my own respect, my own sense of agency, my own ability to protect myself and my interests. Jessica had inadvertently given me the opportunity to reclaim all of those things, and for that, in a strange way, I suppose I owe her a debt of gratitude. I'm 62 years old now, and I understand things about myself that I had forgotten during the long years of marriage and compromise. I understand that kindness is not the same as weakness, that accommodation is not the same as submission, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be anyone other than exactly who you are. I understand that my worth was never dependent on Richard's attention or anyone else's approval, and that the life I'm building now, quiet, purposeful, and entirely my own, is worth more than any performance of happiness I might have maintained for the sake of social expectations. These days, I wake up in my own house, in my own bed, and I make my own decisions about how to spend my time, my energy, and my resources. I practice law because I love it. I help people because it satisfies something deep in my soul, and I answer to no one except myself and my clients. It's a good life, an honest life, and a life that no one can take away from me because I built it with my own hands and my own mind. My children visit regularly now, bringing their own families to the house that will always be their childhood home. They've told me that they're proud of how I handled the situation with Jessica, proud of my return to legal practice, proud of the way I've rebuilt my life according to my own priorities and values. "Mom," Agatha said during her last visit, watching me work in my garden on a warm spring afternoon, "you seem happier than I've seen you in years. More like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For the first time in decades, I am exactly myself, not someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's caretaker, but simply Claire Morrison, a woman with her own goals and her own power and her own very satisfying life. And if some young woman with predatory instincts and elaborate plans ever decides to target another family the way Jessica targeted mine, I hope she runs into someone exactly like me. Someone who looks accommodating and acts gracious, but who remembers, always, that the appearance of vulnerability can be the most powerful camouflage of all. Someone who understands that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, that real power doesn't need to be performed, and that the wisest among us sometimes choose to let others underestimate us until the moment comes to prove them catastrophically wrong.